As incredible as his ability to convince people to do science, which was tough at that time, now it's second nature, but what he did with Freemasonry.
Thank you for joining me on the Unrefined Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Spain, along with Lindsay Waters, where each week we delve into the mysteries that shape our world, from the tangible to the supernatural, with the foundation rooted in biblical truth. For more content and exclusive resources, visit us at unrefinedpodcast.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode. Hey. Today we're exploring historical mysteries with a first-time guest who brings a fresh perspective and a treasure trove of knowledge. He's a researcher with a passion for uncovering hidden histories and untangling the web of secret societies, codes, and philosophies that have shaped the modern world. Get ready for a deep dive into conspiracies, secret writings, and the mysteries behind one of the most enigmatic minds of the Renaissance. Welcome, Robert Frederick, to the show. Hey, Robert, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Brandon. Thanks for having me on.
All right.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, we're super excited about it. Actually, I'm trying to remember who turned me on to. I think it was Lindsay found you.
Yeah, I heard you on Bill Ramsey's podcast and really enjoyed it. I'd heard several different theories about Shakespeare authorship and whatnot, and I know a little bit about Francis Bacon, but had never connected these two things, and it's a new perspective for me.
Yeah, well, and the interesting thing is we're doing a really deep dive into, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because it's going to be a pretty big episode. But we're kind of doing a deep dive into the occult and into a specific cult that we think is probably associated with this. So this just fits right in with what we're already researching and stuff. So we're interested in the Shakespeare stuff, but we're more interested in the intelligence and the MI6 and all that kind of connection as well, and masonry. So that'll kind of give you a direction that we might be going with the questions. So, let's start off with this. So what first drew you to explore the connections between Sir Francis Bacon and the concept of a Gnostic English empire?
Well, I was zeroing in on the British Empire as the reason the world was such a mess, because I felt that in my travels and various occupations, most people are fair and decent, fair-minded.
Yeah.
And the solutions are offered. I was a very solution guy. I was very worried about the environment and all kinds of things. And you see solutions, they never got implemented. And anyway, long story short, I started to see that they didn't want solutions. They wanted problems to solve if they could profit on them. And I think one of the earliest things I got involved in was GMOs. I decided to pick an area and get active. And that kind of clued me into science and how science has been elevated to the status of a religion.
Yeah, scientism. Yeah, definitely.
And Francis Bacon is, quote unquote, the father of modern science. And then I started hearing about Shakespeare authorship, that William Shakespeare didn't write the plays, which is a really easy one. Like, spend a half an hour, especially if you know much about Shakespeare plays. They're incredibly dense. They're philosophical, historical, topical. Like a huge font of knowledge went into every single one of those plays. And that's especially clear now.
Oh, yeah.
That we've had 100 years of literature courses at university, which didn't exist in the 1700s and 1800s. So this whole new idea of Shakespeare authorship came up. Then I found out that Bacon was associated with the founding of America. And I had this huge synchronicity happen, and it was just a big message. Like, look into Francis Bacon specifically, not just the British Empire. And it was sort of like finding a nugget on the ground, or seeing like an odd thing on the ground as you're walking, and you stop and you start clearing away. And what is this thing? And you clear, and there's this enormous, beautiful, ancient statue down there. And that's what it felt like as I started looking into Bacon. I just could not believe what I was finding. And a lot of it is absolutely, normie history. But then as you look at the Shakespeare plays with a jaundiced eye, should I say, with a suspicious eye.
They're loaded.
I mean,
it's amazing. When I listened to your podcast, I was like, wow, man. I mean, I never saw that. You know, I didn't.
No, it's crazy. And then like nobody seems to have seen it over 400 years. And just recently I found from a Polish guy who was a Stalinist in Poland. His name is Jan Kot. And this is like, now years of digging and trying to find somebody critical of Shakespeare. Because
Polish.
His Polish name is Jan Kot. But if anyone is critical of Shakespeare, let's say there's two that I know of. Leo Tolstoy hated Shakespeare. And I think it's Ludwig Wittgenstein, the famous philosopher.
Yeah.
And then people wring their hands like, how could Wittgenstein not like Shakespeare? What's wrong with Wittgenstein?
Well, maybe he sensed the word salad, the word language stuff going on. I mean, he was big on language and its power. So
anyway. I guess so. He wasn't tricked. Yeah, he didn't fall for the Shakespearean tricks. He just straight up said, people don't act like that. That doesn't ring true. And he didn't talk a lot about it. He didn't write whole essays on it, to my knowledge. I'll have to look back into that. But anyway, just like Shakespeare was clearly almost another religion in that he was almost Christ-like. Literally, they made a religion out of him in England. But it became like if Shakespeare did it, it's by definition correct. And you can't really criticize the plays because that you'll defy, it's almost heretical. And then some people say, well, okay, so that character doesn't seem real to life, but you have to understand the entire play is a poem. And you don't ask a poem to be realistic, do you? You have to just let it work on you like poetry. So again, it's putting you in that relaxed state where you're open to suggestion and taking in all these messages. And there's just tons of subliminal messages in Shakespeare that I started to think I'm crazy because nobody else is talking about it.
Well, doesn't he have a whole section of his plays that are histories? I mean, you would think that and I've read through, I think it was Richard. I can't remember. Was there?
Yeah, Richard II, the tragedy of King Richard. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of stuff in there that's not real to life. So, you can't make the excuse of, it's a poem, which, I mean, it is a poem, but,
that's the first clue, Brandon. That is the first clue. And a professor friend who lived next door told me that the history plays had been outed as Tudor propaganda. And this was maybe, I don't know when. So I had this conversation with him 15 years ago. Let's say, I don't know when this started to become common currency among mainstream Shakespeare scholars, that the history plays were actually a form of propaganda. And that really opens the door to looking at all the plays as having ulterior motives. And it's amazing. Nobody noticed for a long time, but that was the opening. It says like something's going on with this guy. That's not art, not straight art, self-expression or history. Yeah, all the history plays have a lot of bad history in them. Oh, I just want to say, for people that like films, there's an excellent film about this by a lady named Philippa Langley, an English woman who got involved with a local group of conspiracy theorists.
Interesting.
who wanted to rehabilitate King Richard III, who was the last king before the Tudor line took over. So Henry VII was the first Tudor king, and he defeated Richard II at the Battle of Bosworth. And that started the Tudor line that Francis Bacon is related to, and started, really, that's when the English Empire started, soon after. But what happened is they wrote, I think this was the play that tipped it off. There's a very famous play called Richard III, where Richard III is portrayed as the nastiest guy imaginable. He's betraying everyone. He's killing people. He's seizing power for his own benefit. And then mercifully, and it's over at the end because Henry VII took power. And it's specifically designed to make Richard III look bad. And this woman, on her own, it's like kind of like a miracle. And Richard III's remains were never known where they were. He was like the only English king that didn't have a grand resting place in a cathedral somewhere. And she, on her own, with help, with her own determination, And this small group, sort of encouraging her, found his bones, and she completely rewrote the history of Richard III. And during the play, people are saying, "You think Richard III was a decent man? Are you quarreling with Shakespeare?" And then they show you the Tudors also would paint portraits of Richard to make him look demonic and evil. So it exposes in this movie, there's a famous English comedian, Steve Coogan, made it and is in it with a famous actress. I don't know her name. They expose Shakespeare as a propagandist in this great movie that's only a couple years old. It's called The Lost King. I highly recommend it. It's a really fun movie. It's got some great, really, really fun, good movie, and it exposes Shakespeare as a propagandist. So that kind of stuff opens the door, and you start looking with a more suspicious eye.
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely. I know a little bit about British history. Now, the end of Richard III and the beginning of the Tudors, that ended the Norman line, right? And it was more of a German English line. Is that accurate? Or
then Henry VII was from Wales.
Okay.
And he married, his queen was still connected to the Norman line, but it's considered the end of the Plantagenet.
The Plantagenet, yeah.
And then they combined end of the War of the Roses, and then the Tudor symbol is the red and the white rose combined. And you've heard the term War of the Roses.
Yeah.
That's from Shakespeare too. It wasn't called the War of the Roses until he put that into those plays. And they needed this propaganda because Henry VII actually had a very tenuous claim to the throne, and his wife had a stronger claim. But actual bloodline tie to the throne was extremely weak. And the one thing you need in England was a bloodline tie to the throne.
I can't remember where I saw or read this, but isn't there still like a guy that, probably several of them, I'm sure some of them are nuts, but who claimed to be or like some sort of Plantagenet claimant to the throne or something like that?
I haven't heard that. There was a dispute for decades after the Tudor was the Stuart line, James Stuart. And they went through the Civil War, and then the Stuart line came back, but they were actually given the heave-ho by Queen Anne and what was it, William of Orange, and that's
Mary.
when the
William and Mary,
William and Mary, the Glorious Revolution, and then somewhere in there, their relatives were German, and the Hanover line came in.
Yeah, with the Georges and all that kind of stuff.
It has been a blood tie since then, but it became very, very German.
Yeah.
And there was a pretender. They called him the pretender to the throne, Bonnie Prince.
Yep, Bonnie Prince Charlie.
Charlie.
Or Bonnie Prince. Yep.
Well, that's interesting, the connection to the whole German thing, which we can come back to. But what do you find in your context of I'm going to focus here and here. We're going to hit Shakespeare, but like you said, there's a lot of that already out there and stuff. But I'm really interested in this vein that you found of gold. Of how do you define Gnostic in the context of what we're talking about with Bacon and England or the UK or the English Empire, I guess was what it was back then. So what do you mean by the word Gnostic? How would you define that? Where did you get that terminology from?
So Gnosticism is the idea, and this is the one idea that connects all the different Gnostic groups, is that the world was created as a prison for our souls. The world is not good. We're trapped here. Our souls are trapped here. And that Yahweh is actually an evil demiurge. And most of these groups reject the Old Testament. And many of them see Jesus Christ as someone who came to tell them that the world is evil and they have to escape the world by various methods. And then every Gnostic group has different methods to gain gnosis. So they're called Gnostic because they believe in, they're not faith-based, they're knowledge-based, or gnosis, where they have an experience of this idea that the souls are trapped here on earth. And it started at the time of Christ. Historically, they say the first Gnostic was Simon Magus, and he's in the Acts of the Apostles trying to get Peter to teach him magic. He saw what the apostles were doing as magic, and he wanted some of that. And there's a lot of stuff about Simon Magus. He was a real person.
I read something about that the other day. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's totally fascinating. You look into Simon, Acts of the Apostles, and that's where the term simony came from Simon, in that he wanted to pay Peter to teach him. So this whole idea that he paid the church for absolution of sins is called simony, from Simon Magus. Magus is magician. And since then, the Gnostics were associated with magic. But really what they did, and all these different groups, was take any sort of religion, anything from any religion. They became syncretic. And they might take something from Judaism. They would take Jesus Christ from Christianity. They took Neoplatonic theory and thought. A lot of it's kind of Buddhist, that this idea of the world is an illusion or false.
Yeah.
But nobody had ever said the world is evil. And it's borderline on Christianity, who believe you pass through the world, don't become of this world, pass through it. Your true home is elsewhere. So it's a neighbor to Christianity, but there's a clean break with every other, what I can find, every previous religion or any religion since. The world is actually fake and even evil. It's almost chilling. So then it's very creative religion. So different groups would take different approaches to how to live their life if they think that the creator was evil. And it was squashed by the Romans when they converted to Christianity, and it was thought to have died out by the 5th century. But different parts of it popped up in different areas, and it became a force again in France.
The Cathars.
The Cathars and the Albigensian Crusade. Kabbalah is definitely Gnostic, a form of Gnosticism. I think the Talmud is a form of Gnosticism. A lot of scholars have traced it to disaffected Jews who were angry that the promises of the Bible didn't come through, that Jerusalem fell to the Romans. And it's a bitter religion. It's the ultimate grievance trip.
Well, it's ultimately very secret too. That's to me, that's the key word, right? I mean, or was it always secretive, or did it just become that way when the Templars and all them adopted it? Which we'll get to.
I think it became secret when the Romans, wiped them out. Okay. They fell of their own accord because they were just so batty. But on the other hand, they had really popular religions. There's one called Manichaeism. Manichaeism. And that spread all the way to China, up Africa. To Europe, northern Africa.
Augustine,
And that, he was a Manichaean first. And that eventually petered out, not exactly sure why, but Christianity was also just much stronger in terms of a religion, like the Gnostic groups. I'm kind of mixing it up with the mystery schools, but I'm not entirely clear on why Manichaeanism failed, but maybe it really didn't, because it became the Cathars. And there's another group called the Bogomils.
But then there's the Balkans.
The Balkans. And they influenced the Manichaeans and the Cathars. And then there's it's considered more Jewish, but Kabbalah is really almost everything but Jewish. There's almost no Old Testament in there. It's completely in violation of Scripture, which says do not do magic. Magic's absolutely prohibited, and Kabbalah is all about magic. It's essentially a system for doing magic. So it's kind of strange, and there was conflict in the Jewish world about it. Maimonides said don't do Kabbalah. Maimonides kind of was before the heyday of Kabbalah, but he saw it coming because it was festering in that area of southern France, southwestern France, and southeastern Spain. It's where Kabbalah and Gnosticism really took off, and that's where the Cathars were, and that's where Kabbalah originated. And the early Kabbalah was southwestern France too. But they don't think they influenced each other a whole lot. Just reading about that today. But there's some similarity there in the Gnosticism, and ultimately it gets kind of crazy in that they believe they can be God. They not only challenge God or say creator of this world, but they they feel they can gain such power as to be God or be a God, which is such a nutty idea to me that it's hard to believe, but you see it. You actually see it written down.
Well, it goes back to the garden. I mean, what did the serpent said? You can be God, and it's just carried forward.
100%.
Yeah,
absolutely. And just one more thing about Kabbalah.
Yeah.
When I did a deep dive into the Kabbalah, I noticed that the adopters of the Kabbalah all thought they were the Messiah.
Oh,
which was kind of a form of God from the very first guy who's respected. Ari the Lion was the first one to bring Kabbalah out of Spain to the Middle East, and then Sabbatai Sevi and the Sabbateans.
Yeah.
He thought he was the Messiah, but the first guy in Spain did too. I think he was Abu Lafia, who went to Rome to tell the Pope he's the Messiah. The Messiah's here.
Well, that's
crazy.
Sabbatai Levi. He would. I think at some point he encouraged his followers to just pretend they were Christians, but still kind of work their nonsense into everything.
And you hide, and that's the secrecy started, and you pretend.
And the intelligent stuff, yep.
And then you get into intelligent, but the antinomian means you reject all
law,
moral law, and that you can pretend, though. You can pretend to follow the law. And sometimes the people that follow the law the most are because they're actually hiding their antinomian behavior.
Yeah, well, it can go either way there.
Yeah. And this is a big movement. And I think I just noticed today, because I'm finishing up an essay on the Templars, and they had a contact with the assassins in the Middle East, who were an antinomian Muslim group who pretended to be devout Muslim.
Yeah, the Ismailis, they're sort of still around. I mean, a group descended from them is still around. It's a very peaceful, sort of philanthropic group now.
That we know of.
Right.
Yeah. So there's so much going on behind the scenes that it just reminds me of the Wizard of Oz. Don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain, and this whole story.
You have to really use critical thinking and discernment and stay aware. You have to be, on your guard. But what I found with Bacon, like I said, it's creative.
Yeah.
There's so many different groups. Is that Bacon's big insight was that Gnosticism could use science to gain power in the world.
All right. Lay that out for us. Yeah.
Knowledge is power is the most famous saying of Francis Bacon.
Yeah.
Well, gnosis means knowledge.
Yeah.
And
it's still said today. I mean, we still say that in the education.
It's catching on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's catching on. Because now, why isn't knowledge compassion or truth or beauty or peace? It's power. That's what he literally wanted in the earth realm. But it could also be a Gnostic credo, because when you have knowledge, you escape your bounds, the limitations of the prison on earth. But Bacon also, and he says this, he veils it in the Rosicrucians, but he does say it in his own writings on science, which he really did. He started the movement of modern science.
Yeah.
He said, for relief of man's estate, which means he doesn't say to make us more comfortable, to make our lives easier. He wrote everything in double and triple layer. So that's a direct quote from one of his books, for relief of man's estate, which also can have a Gnostic layer to it, to escape the demiurge. And by the way, Scientology is straight up Gnostic religion, and they believe there's archons. They even took the terminology of Gnosticism, which has archons guarding the earth.
There's my connection right there to the Process Church. That's where they came from, out of England.
Bingo.
Yep.
Bingo. Which is straight up Masonry.
Yeah. Well,
but getting into the Mormons a little bit, and apparently they have this whole. I don't know. I haven't. That's what I shouldn't even bring that up.
Well, no. I mean, we've done stuff on the Mormons. Mormons are influenced by Masonry, so that's probably how it came in. But I think there's other stuff in there too, and. I mean, they have weird doctrines like the whole serpent seed doctrine, where they wouldn't allow blacks in for years, and that's hidden. And that's the interesting thing to me about these secret societies, and we can go more into them, because I mean, to me, Bacon, and I don't know if you agree with me or not, but he's the father of the modern secret societies, in my opinion.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, even before
absolutely.
Albert Pike and all them.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
But the secrecy, is there, but it only gets to what the higher levels. The lower level people actually don't really know what they're doing. That's always been
100%.
our understanding of it. I think that's in Mormonism. I think it's in a lot of these other, even some of these Masonic groups as well. I was tapped when I was a young uh, uh, adult, and something felt funny about it, and I didn't do it. And so
Nice.
it was, yeah, it for a young 20-something-year-old, it's power, to be able to be tapped and to know that I could have been more successful or more whatever. I was wanting to be a lawyer, and so I mean, a
Uh-huh.
lawyer and a masonry fits hand in glove. So
Yeah.
anyway, but
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the brilliance of it. Why I say that, as incredible as Shakespeare is, and as incredible as his ability to convince people to do science, which was tough at that time. Now it's second nature, but
yeah,
what he did with Freemasonry is even more fascinating because he structured it like that. You didn't you didn't you didn't sign your name in blood when you got into Freemasonry by any means. It's just the opposite,
yeah,
in that it's a fraternal organization
right,
to make good men better,
yeah,
based on charity. And he was always talking about charity in his writing. And it's more hidden, it's more the veil. And yeah, it wouldn't be till a while that you might get tapped once you're in. And just at the entry level would be so many benefits, especially back in the day,
yeah, yeah,
in terms of a job, or if you traveled, you could just stay at another lodge or instantly have lodge brother friends wherever you went. It definitely made your professional life easier. Lots of benefits, just the psychological benefits, because what Bacon was the first real psychologist, I think, in a systematic way.
All right.
Like the
What do you mean by that? Yeah.
psychological benefits of being in a lodge were just so great.
Community. Yeah.
The community, the identity, the secrets. Like, you definitely start keeping secrets right away when you're a Freemason, like immediately. You're blindfolded until you will be killed in a very gruesome way if you reveal any secrets, which you say out loud. You take an oath, and oaths are very important psychologically, because
Yeah.
we have honor. There's something in us about honor that's built in. It's part of human consciousness. And you immediately take an oath that you feel bad breaking. And then you have secrets about what's going on in the lodge that nobody else knows. I mean, to this day, people don't realize anything about Freemasonry, but it's right in their midst. It's part of that hiding in plain sight thing that Bacon developed, which I always thought was a cliche, but it's not.
Well, and there's entire Christian denominations with wide open arms that have accepted them in as it's okay. It's compatible with Christianity. You can be a Mason, and they have no idea. And I think a lot of it is, like we said, because the lower levels don't have any idea.
They don't.
Well,
And
and the philanthropy, like
yep,
the
they do good things.
Like the Shriner. Oh, you don't like the Shriners helping those poor little kids?
Yeah. That's part of the veiling. And they use the Christian morality on the entry level, but there's nothing Christian in the early degrees at all. And yeah, they just don't notice. Although I haven't had time to look into this, but I have heard that the Anglican Church was the only large Christian denomination that completely accepted Freemasonry, or Church of England, they call it over there.
Yeah.
We call it Anglican.
Yeah.
And that they were totally fine with Freemasonry, and even the Archbishop of Canterbury was a Freemason. And
they're in he's in the Druidic type stuff. Yeah, big time.
Now
and
the new guy is
yeah.
But yeah, they had no problem with it, and that's why it was so genius. And then they do attract a lot of good people, so that's another veiling. Is that Joe Smith's a Freemason. He's a wonderful, decent guy, and so they hide like that in plain sight. And then something I want to talk to you about, actually, is this weaponization of empathy where they use that Christian value of compassion to help create the empire. Because London is a very religious city. There's more churches in London than in Rome. They're very, very Christian nation.
What's love bombing? It's what most cults do. They love bomb you.
They love bomb you, but then they get you to go to India and Australia and Burma and do terrible things. Because this is my thing about Freemasonry. I said, if they made good men better, why were Freemasons so involved in the early slave trade? Which you don't hear about because they don't publicize that, but that's come out recently, only recently, that the Masons were selling black people from Africa into America. That's not a good man better. And that's, throughout their empire, they did horrible things. And the Freemasons, this broke open the dam for me too. There's the first ever book on Freemasonry, which is, 300 years old officially, 400 years old if you count Francis Bacon as solidifying it around 1600. The first scholarly book on Freemasonry came about 20 years ago, and she even says why there haven't been a lot of scholarly books on Freemasonry, but she details very intricately like how the Freemasons were the first globalists, how every single British regiment had a lodge. So that's the other genius of Freemasonry. It's portable. You take your lodge with you. And every single army regiment had a Mason's lodge and were part of making a soldier feel comfortable far from home because he had his lodge brothers. That's just one level of it. There's all kinds of ways Freemasonry benefited the empire. And some of it, we have to admit is good in that it did sort of ease class distinctions, which of course Christianity had already done. But it helped ease class distinctions a little bit. And there's all kinds of reasons that it benefited the individual man psychologically and emotionally. And then the ones that were really worthwhile and would help at the higher level get pulled into the darker stuff, like you were saying.
Do you think that Bacon had a vision for all this when he was? I mean, he's such a brilliant man. I've heard you on your podcast say he was the smartest man that ever lived. I told somebody that, and they said, "No, Solomon was." Well, I'm like, well, Solomon was the wisest man, but I think Bacon was the most intelligent, probably. And
Solomon backtracked too. Now, Bacon does hold Solomon up. Bacon does constantly talk about Solomon. That's interesting that you said that. Because I always say Jesus was God, so he doesn't count.
Right.
I kind of forgot about Solomon, actually. But Bacon is always talking about Solomon and using Solomon. And then Solomon backslid and was an occultist.
Exactly. There's a lot of people don't know that. We've said that on our show, and we've had some backlash from people saying, well, you think he, was always like that, or did he turn back? I'm like, no, he went down some really dark roads, and you really see it in the book of Maccabees with his special amulet ring that he has and stuff. And he was a thoroughgoing occultist, and I think in a lot of ways they consider him the father of Masonry. I think.
Yeah, I think that's one reason Bacon elevates him. I think it's another dodge and another hiding, is that he's actually undercutting all the religions. He's undercutting. People say it's Jewish. Well, he's actually undercutting Judaism. They say Freemasonry is Jewish. I think he's undercutting Judaism, like Solomon nearly did. And there was a cleanup operation. I forget how it goes. I read it recently. But yeah, there's just tons of stuff on Solomon backsliding in the Bible, and it's just not well known.
Yeah, I mean, there's books, occult books. I'm not going to name them, that are out there that are his occult type books that are written about him and written with his lore and all that. So it's
good point.
If you're an esoterist, I mean, we have a guy. He's an ex-esoterist, and he'll tell you that there's Solomon is mixed up in all the occult stuff, not just the secret society stuff. And it's really interesting why it's Solomon. I guess the first temple maybe had something to do with that. I don't know. Yeah. But
I think it's part of that backsliding. And it's vague in the Bible, but it's either his wife or he did sacrifices. they make it seem like his wives were doing them, and that's why he did it, because his
Right.
wives were doing the sacrifices. So it's
High
left a little
places,
bit
yeah.
vague, but yeah, he was clearly doing magic, clearly forbidden by the Bible. And so that's why those books came up, and I think that's why Bacon elevates him. Throughout his writings, he's always mentioning Solomon.
Yeah. Robert, here's kind of a tough question. How much of the idea of America, we'll call it Americanism, has Bacon given to us, would you say?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a book over here that I read, and I need to reread. The guy definitely pegs Bacon more than almost anyone else.
What's the name of the book where I can put it in the show notes?
It's Rosicrucian Rosicrucian America. How a secret society influenced the destiny of a nation.
Well, maybe before you go into Lindsay's question, you need to kind of outline to everybody out there what is Rosicrucians and how it came about to be.
Okay. Now, part of the problem here is the Rosicrucians really were a hoax, I think, invented by Bacon.
Yeah.
That came out in 1614, 1615, supposedly out of Germany.
Mm-hmm.
It caused a furor in Germany and France and elsewhere in Europe by these, what seemed to us really preposterous pamphlets of a sort now, manifestos they're called, the Rosicrucian manifestos. And two of them came out, the Fama Fraternitatis and Fraternity again, the famous fraternity. I forget the title of the second one. And two of these things came out, and they talked about an invisible college of learned men who were working to bring the world to a new place. And it was kind of covered in Christianity, which of course it had to be then if it was going to go public. And it made these kind of overtures to Christianity. But the first thing it said, a total reformation of the world. Which is almost an exact quote of what Francis Bacon said when he was 14 years old and dropped out of college, 14 or 15. And that he was going to reform the whole world. He was going to challenge Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle was like a demigod then in philosophy. Yeah. And, Aquinas had brought Aristotle into the church, and everything was Aristotle. And the philosophy was scholasticism, and they spent just hours and hours detailing, how Aristotle fits in with Christianity, and philosophy had gotten very dry, and as Bacon says, disputatious and not geared toward progress. I mean, he knew this when he was 15. Not geared toward progress. It's really freaky. So that's the first line of the Rosicrucian Manifesto, which immediately ties it to Bacon. And then the ideas in it are so much like Bacon. There's many ways to tie Bacon to the Rosicrucians. And people love to say, oh, we don't know who wrote it, or nobody knows who wrote it. But people who know, like the great scholar Francis Yates, who really opened the door to this whole occult in England. She wrote a book called The Occult in Elizabethan England. And it was like, what? But it's all there. She just had a certain job at the Warburg Foundation where she could spend all her time researching this stuff, and she put out great book after great book. The Rosicrucian Enlightenment by Francis Yates details.
She related to William Butler by any chance?
No, she's Yates.
Okay, not Yeats.
She's a devout Christian, brilliant scholar, interesting person. She just was kind of born to do the work she did, and she's a legend. She pegs Bacon as kind of looks like Bacon was the guy behind the Rosicrucians, but we'll never know, or something like that. I forget, but she can't come out and say that in her position as a mainstream thinker and work. It's like not like people today where we can write books and say what we want based on what we think. I think, and she was pretty old by then. I think she was already in her 70s when she wrote those two books. It was kind of at the end of her career. Those two books, The Occult in Elizabethan England and The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, are legendary. And of course, she wrote a lot about Shakespeare too. But she had already become an expert on Tudor England just out of her own interest.
Well, interesting too that the Rosicrucian symbol is the two roses, basically, right?
I mean, the English symbolism is the rose and the cross, the red cross on the white flag, the rose and the cross, Rosicrucian. I mean, it's, again, hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
But of course, Martin Luther had used it. And then I found recently, because I'm so deep into the Templars who survived in Portugal, they had the rose and cross first, even before Martin Luther. But anyway, that's something I'm just newly getting into. But yeah, the rose and the cross and England, it's kind of big part of England.
Yeah. Right.
And so yeah, that's Rosicrucianism, and and I think I keep saying they are the beginning of transhumanism, because he does say in there the prolongation of life and the ending of disease, and like kind of canceling out old age. He's hinting at not dying as a human, which hints at this kind of godlike status for the human. That's going to be part of, when I finally consolidate why I say Francis Bacon is Gnostic, that'll be part of it. But it's really and he was right. That point marks the beginning of science, because his next book came out 1623 and 1620, the two other books on science that really captivated people. And soon after was Descartes. And then soon after was the English explosion in science with people like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, John Locke. And they literally point to Francis Bacon as their hero, their Moses, their leader, the guy that got them going. And so he's fully recognized as the father of modern science. He's hinted at as being Rosicrucian. And where were we going when you said to hold up on the Rosicrucian?
Yeah, Lindsay asked you a good question. I want to get back to it. Now, you were talking about Bacon and his influence in America, in Americanism, so to speak.
Well, it's a really interesting question. People make then what people do now with Bacon is, when they find out how incredible he was, they kind of worship him. And the legends and stories about him go. One is that he never died. He became Saint Germain. And he's, still influencing everything today. But part of my task is to show how he started Freemasonry. And then Freemasonry played a big part of the founding of the United States, as you know. And there were two streams that came from England. One were the Pilgrims, but they were 9 or 10 years later than Jamestown, Virginia, which was related to Bacon. And that was the aristocratic group that came as a corporation, the Virginia Corporation. Virginia is named after Queen Elizabeth because she was the Virgin Queen.
Yeah.
So they sent their corporation here. America was founded by a corporation. Bacon helped form the first modern corporations, which is amazing. That's just another part of his, curriculum vitae.
Renaissance man to the nth degree.
To the nth degree.
Yeah.
He knew about finance. He encouraged Queen Elizabeth to make charging of interest on loans legal. So it became legal to charge interest on loans under Queen Elizabeth because of Francis Bacon. So I've heard. I haven't locked in that source yet, but
there's probably a connection there to the Rothschilds. Then
eventually, not yet. There were no Jews in England at the time.
Oh, that's right.
What's cool about this theory of mine is it exonerates the Jews. There were no Jews in England. If they were converted. They had converted.
Or Spain. They had been evicted from Spain in 1492.
1492.
Yeah.
France, 1298, I think. There were still, though, Jews. There wasn't some Jewish moneylenders in London, which I haven't quite figured that out. It's on my list. I'll get to that. But you couldn't live openly as a Jew. You had to go to church every Sunday by law. And that's the other way they used kind of Christianity. It was a theocratic state. And that's the other part of the story, is that the war between the Protestants and the Catholics was at fever pitch.
Yeah.
This entire time.
Have you heard the rumor? I have before, but I just wondered if you'd heard it, that London is its own entity like the Vatican is. Have you heard about that?
Yeah. That's true, but it's way overblown.
Okay.
Yeah, they do have a separate city there, and it's basically close to the old London Wall. And that was a deal made when Norman the Conqueror, no, what's his name? William the Conqueror, the Norman. Norman the Conqueror.
I like
That's
it.
good.
Gilbert the Conqueror. That's crazy.
He came in and took over, and to smooth his path, he said, look, okay, you guys in London, you can make your own rules. And that is where the finance is, and that's right where the old Templar church is, and Fleet Street, and the financial district is there. But they don't really have a separate entity there, and the queen doesn't have to ask permission to come in. It's just totally ceremonial. Right. And they're completely subject to the laws of England. But it's like they have their own mayor, and they can make their own rules.
That it had something to do with the fact that London is the capital of like 3 different countries, so to speak, or it's not really countries, more confederacies. Great Britain, United Kingdom, and then England.
London, Vatican, and Washington D.C.
Yeah.
And Vatican especially is considered a country, so that's true.
Yeah.
DC is interesting in that they can't vote for president in DC, right? Because they actually don't get a vote for president. Something's different about DC, and London is a little bit separated from England, but not really. That's really overblown. All these stories get overblown, like Bacon never dying and becoming Saint Germain, or the Templars finding the Ark of the Covenant at the Temple of Solomon and hiding it.
Well, there's got to be disinformation, Robert. Or it's got. I mean, they put it out, I think, on purpose to deflect smokescreen.
They do that for sure, and then we all love a good story, and we're all easily fooled. Because I say, it was one thing I like to say is because we're good at heart. And we're easily fooled. We want to believe, and we want to be trust you and be trusting, and that's how humans are. And so we're kind of easy to fool. We like good stories too. I mean, we live by stories, and so it's what's really strange is when people get an unshakable faith in these rather preposterous tales for which there's almost no evidence, but there's maybe a hint of evidence. And I think this guy, Stephen Sorer, who actually wrote one of the first books that I really liked about, kind of the hidden power. I think he probably goes too far in here. What happens is I read these books, and then 5 years later I pick them up, and it's like I never read it because I'm a totally different person with lots more knowledge. And I'm like, oh yeah, right, he did talk about this. But there is fascinating stuff about Bacon and America, and that he definitely was involved at Jamestown. There seems to be this whole Oak Island thing that he's connected to. He's part of the settlement in Maine. But all of that is really tamped down. Like, I'll read these big biographies of Bacon, and they won't even mention that he was on the board of the Virginia Corporation that settled Jamestown. Like, that's a major piece of information. And they just won't mention it, and so you've got to go somewhere else to find it. And they don't really want you to put the pieces together, and I don't think they want people to know too much about Bacon. And that's one way to deflect interest, is to just make it preposterous. And that's how the Masons did it, where they said King Solomon was the first Mason. Or they'll even go to Euclid. Euclid and King Solomon, and she was like, oh, forget it. You guys are just nuts. You're a dinner club, a men's club to have dinner. And they don't bother checking it out because it just gets so preposterous. And it's the same with the Knights Templar.
I've
and
heard
this
a lot
Dan
about
Brown.
that.
Did you see? I never saw the Da Vinci Code. But that, like the Templars. The bloodline of Jesus. And I mean, it's just like,
I saw the prequel, and I kind of liked it, but they didn't get into all that in the prequel. I forget the name, Angels and Demons or whatever. But
they made a prequel, right?
Yeah.
Well, speaking of absurd and all this, tell me if this is absurd. When the Bacon mythos, I'll call it that, the whole New Atlantis and his vision of a Gnostic society. What do you think about that?
Honestly, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Okay.
Because the Shakespeare stuff is fascinating, and I love analyzing the plays, and the Freemasonry is fascinating, but so much of it is hidden how much will I ever really know? I put a lot of clues. But the New Atlantis, he couldn't even publish it during his lifetime. It came out after he was dead, or quotation marks dead, because of course there's a whole theory that he faked his death.
Another conspiracy theory, yeah. Yep.
Even though there's no evidence of it.
I think there's a place somewhere with Elvis and him and, you know, all these people, Michael Jackson. They're all, hey, we just faked our deaths. Jim Morrison. Anyway.
Definitely.
I just watched or actually listened to a podcast about Saint Germain, and I don't recall him even bringing up the aspect of it being Francis Bacon, you know, reincarnated, so to speak.
That's one branch of Baconian worship, or Saint Germain. I mean, there's there's 2 or 3 Rosicrucian groups that aren't connected to the original Rosicrucians, but they might claim that they are, and they say Bacon was our founder. There's AMORC, American Order of Rosicrucians, AMORC. They're big in California. So there's all kinds of...
So are they connected at all to the Catholic Church, or is it loosely, or is it's not at all? Okay, then why is it associated with the Catholic Church all the time? That's what's so... I mean...
I don't think it is. Did you see that?
Okay. No, I've just heard different people, they act like it's like the Templars, that it was a religious order.
The Templars.
Yeah.
The Templars were a Catholic order.
Yeah.
But Rosicrucian were actually against the Pope and kind of railed against the Pope. But the Templars are not connected to the Rosicrucians. They got wiped out in 1307, and very end of the Crusades. So they were formed near the very beginning of the Crusades with the idea that they would protect pilgrims who had left Europe and gone to the Holy Land and wanted to visit Jerusalem and see the Sea of Galilee and stuff like that, and they were being robbed. And this is after the First Crusade, which started like 1095 or 6 and took Jerusalem in 1099. So the Catholics conquered Jerusalem in 1099 in a horrible, horrible bloodbath.
Yeah, I've heard.
And then they had a kingdom, and they had a king of Jerusalem, and they had the kingdom of Jerusalem, and they controlled a wide swath of present-day Israel. Yeah. And the Templars then were formed 20 years later with the blessing of the Cistercian order in France, and it was a real French thing. The French were more powerful than the English at the time.
Yeah.
And the Franks were more powerful, and they were probably the main force of the First Crusade. I'm far from an expert on the Crusades. There were like 9 or 10 of them. The first one was victorious, went to Jerusalem, and had a kingdom of Jerusalem. And the Templars were formed 20 years later, and their full name is the Poor Knights of Christ in the Temple of Jerusalem. And they took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But they were also trained fighting knights. You had to be a noble to be one. They were mounted warriors, with swords, and each knight needed a couple aides. And, there was a whole thing. They needed a whole support group. So there were quite a few other Templars in support positions. It wasn't all just guys on horseback.
Mm-hmm.
And they ultimately failed as fighters and left the Holy Land ignominiously after a terrible defeat at Acre, present-day Israel. They also had a castle in Gaza. So it's very much tied to present day. They had a castle in Gaza.
Wow.
Gaza was a city then. Acre was a city then, and it's still a city in Israel. I just found out. I looked that up. And what they became successful at was banking. They were the first international bankers, even preceding the Italian, at scale, developing all kinds of bookkeeping. You weren't supposed to charge interest. Jews could loan money at interest. Christians could not, so they would just take a fee. We're going to take a storage fee. They stored all kinds of both relics, but also gold and precious objects. And they had a very large shipping part of their operations. They could move people to the Holy Land quickly, move money and gold quickly if they had to. They developed a checking system, but they got extraordinarily wealthy because people would donate property to them. because then they would work the property, take the profits, and funnel it into the Holy Land to fight the Saracens, the heathens, and take back Jerusalem. And eventually they failed, and they were headquartered on Cyprus. There were two other similar orders, the Knights Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights. And, eventually this was going to run afoul of the authorities because they were vastly wealthy, but they were answerable only to the Pope. And as what anyone probably could have predicted, especially since they were no longer operating in the Holy Land, they ran afoul of the king. There was a lot of resentment because they didn't actually have to answer to the king. They only answered to the Pope. They didn't pay taxes. They didn't even tithe. Everything was supposed to go, to the Holy Land. Well, they weren't in the Holy Land anymore. And King Philip IV, with the blessing of Pope Clement V, moved on the Templars en masse on Friday the 13th, October 1307. And he arrested apparently a couple thousand Templars at once in France and put them on trial, tortured them. Stories came up that they were worshiping a head called Baphomet. They were spitting on the cross. There were homosexual initiation rituals. All this stuff came up.
Is this de Molay and that whole
and
era?
And then he was the last Grandmaster, Jacques de Molay, and he confessed rather quickly without torture. But then 5 years later, he recanted. And that was one way you could, if someone confessed and then took back their confession, that was an immediate sign of guilt. And it was really the king, the Pope. Okay, so now, there's just tons of interpretations and tons of books about the Templars. Right. But it's clear that Philip was the driving force. And so he had already burned 54 Templars in a field outside Paris, which might have been on the island. And then he burned Jacques de Molay in 1314 and one other Templar on that island where Notre Dame is. If you've ever been to Paris, you've been to Notre Dame. Notre Dame, Our Lady. So they burned him, right next to the cathedral, within sight of the cathedral anyway. And the Pope had already dissolved the order 2 years earlier, but that was the final blow. And the Templars were not popular because they were haughty and proud, didn't have to answer to anyone, extraordinarily wealthy, richer than kings, and nobody liked them. But I think seeing them burned like that, and then most of them melted back into society or went to monasteries. But some countries didn't arrest them at all. And in Portugal, they just changed their name. Instead of the Poor Knights of Christ in the Temple of Solomon, they became the Order of Christ. No arrests, no torture, no confessions, nothing. And not by accident, not by coincidence, did Portugal become the first big empire out of Europe.
That's interesting. You're right. Yeah.
Before Spain.
Before Spain. And it was the Templars as Order of Christ, and you just don't hear much about the Order of Christ.
Right. So how does Bacon relate to that? I mean,
well, that's
obviously
part of the theory. So the other theory is that the Templars, many of them, escaped. So it took 3 months for King Edward II to move on the Templars in England. He didn't want to do it. I found out that the Templars were always close to the kings and queens of England. He didn't want to move on the Templars, but you had to. The Pope said it. It's really hard for us to imagine the power of the papacy and the church in those days. But if the Pope said do it, you had to do it. So eventually he did. He didn't want to torture anyone. I mean, that's one thing about England. They had pretty good laws in a lot of ways. They started with the what's it called? The 1200s. It'll come to me in a second. But they couldn't torture, but they did finally torture. And they extracted some confessions. But most of the Templars just either went into monasteries or just confessed and lived a normal life. But a lot of them, they think, ran up to Scotland, where the famous Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated by the Pope a few years earlier. Pope sent him a letter, arrest all the Templars, and he just put the letter in a drawer and ignored it. And they were at war with England, excommunicated by the church, so they would take any help they could get. So there is evidence that some Templars made it up to Scotland. And this is where the big theory comes in. This is the grand theory. Nobody talks about Portugal. Everyone talks about Scotland. And apparently, by testimony, in the famous Battle of Bannockburn, which is the story of Mel Gibson and Braveheart, the big battle that secured independence for Scotland for the next 200 years, they defeated the English. And it's true, there are eyewitness accounts of fresh fellows coming out of the woods at the last minute and turning the tide for the Scots. And rumors have been rife that it was the Templars. And it makes a lot of sense because of all those things, that they weren't moving on the Templars, and the Templars wanted revenge on the church and against England, and they've been shut down by England. And so I've just finished a multi-week dive into this. What I find interesting is that there's definitely evidence. That's where Freemasonry began, by the way, in Scotland.
Yeah.
That's now scholarly information that's very recent,
yep.
20 or 30 years. They've traced it. It's a lie. They did not start in roving bands of stonemasons building cathedrals in Europe. That's now definitely a lie. We know where it started, and we know why it started there to a large degree. And then there's Portugal with the First Empire made an alliance with England very soon after, like 1389. Not sure why, but they needed bolstering, and so Portugal and England have always been close. So there's a Templar connection there, and there's a Templar connection through Scotland. Scotland and France had the old alliance, and the Queen of Scotland was a French woman, Mary of Guise, and that those three countries had even though the French and the English were always at war, nothing much ever really happened after a certain point. And it was really more Spain versus England. And Bacon's other prophecy was, this is in writing, he said, one day Scotland and England joined will make a great empire.
Wow.
He predicted it, and it happened. And I'm sure part of it was that he knew about the Templars and Freemasonry, and he knew that he had done Freemasonry in England. And he really advocated for a union of the two countries, which began during his lifetime. After Queen Elizabeth died, King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England. And that was the beginning of Scottish-English union. And people don't think much about Scotland, but they played a huge role in the empire. They played a huge role in the early science. Some of the greatest early scientists were Scottish, and mathematicians.
I mean, I could roll off a bunch of them offhand. Yeah. So, well, look, let me. We probably need to land this plane, but what I'd like to ask you, for our audience out there, if people wanted to dive into this and to begin to study this, what would be the first few resources that you would recommend for them to obviously listen to your podcast, which we'll get into, and but what would be some good books or papers to understand the deeper implications of Bacon's work?
That's a really good question.
One or two would be fine. I'll put them on our show notes. And
in terms of the Shakespeare, there's I don't know. There's the Francis Bacon Research Trust. There's my website, The Hidden Life is Best.
All right, I'm going to put that. Yeah, Hidden Life is Best.
HiddenLifeIsBest.com. There's the first episode in my podcast series. What's the time? Episode 1, The Life and Times of Francis Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon. That's a good overview. It's only 45 minutes long. Kind of walks you through the whole thing. And the first 3 episodes of my podcast will get you up to speed. Because at episode 4, I start going into the Shakespeare. Episode 2 has the scientism, because what he prophesied in the New Atlantis was a technocracy, was a society based on science. And he made science a religion. And my theory is he made 3 religions. Freemasonry, definitely a religion. Science is a religion now. I mean, trust the science. Definitely. Who says trust in God anymore? It's trust the science.
Trust the science. Yep.
And they've got everyone thinking science is the answer and can solve all problems unconsciously.
so empirical, and it's really not empirical. I mean,
it's right.
They're practicing. Doctors are practicing. We forget that.
Yeah, good one. Yeah, it's a faith-based operation, science, and people think faith has been taken out of it. It's just evidence.
Yeah.
But that's not true. That's another conversation, but it's unconsciously a religion, and they have their relics and their saints, and, you know.
They're evangelists and everything.
Exactly. And then I think Shakespeare, slightly tongue-in-cheek, is a religion, but you know what? I wrote an article, it's on Substack called, and Patreon, my Patreon is called, Why the Shakespeare Hoax is So Important. Because they hoaxed Shakespeare. They made it seem like William Shakespeare wrote it. Intentional hoax, a massive hoax with this book called The First Folio. And that's the Shakespeare angle. But if you read that, you'll see that they literally made a religion out of Shakespeare. Bacon didn't, but the people that just pick up the ball, people take suggestion and created this religion out of Shakespeare, which is still running today in the academies. It's starting to break down, I think, but not quite yet. Like, people are still very hesitant to criticize Shakespeare. He's just the greatest thing. This great writer. Oh my God, Shakespeare.
The muse,
And it's just mind-boggling to me. So I think my stuff is the best to bring it all together.
Yeah.
Because the other stuff kind of mythologizes Bacon. But if you want to get into the Bacon side, there's a website, sirbacon.org.
Okay.
There's the Francis Bacon Society. There's this guy named Peter Dawkins, Francis Bacon Research Trust. But all these guys worship Bacon. They don't see anything wrong with the Rosicrucians, nothing wrong with Freemasonry, nothing wrong with the British Empire, nothing wrong with Shakespeare. Shakespeare's all good.
So you really got to, I guess what I would recommend to everybody out there, you guys, is start with Robert's stuff to give you that foundation of what you're looking for, and then just eat the meat, spit out the bones as you go into the other stuff.
There you go. Yep. And then there's the Francis Yates. If you want to know about the Rosicrucians,
I wrote her.
The Rosicrucian Enlightenment and the occult in Elizabethan England. And I'll just say this. That Francis Bacon is considered the patron saint of the Enlightenment. So there's the Middle Ages.
Fascinating. Wow.
It's incredible. Then there's the Renaissance, right? Starting in Italy, and there's all reasons for that. And then there's, after the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. And that's pegged to Francis Bacon by multiple scholars. And guess what Freemasons tell you will become if you join Freemasonry? You'll become enlightened.
Yeah.
And it's all light symbolism.
Yeah.
And enlightenment. And that's
Luciferian. Yeah.
It's
light bringer. Yep.
The light bringer and light, which who could argue with light? I mean, you know.
Yeah.
And then they use sun as a hidden symbol. If people want to really get into Romeo and Juliet, I can't believe what Romeo and Juliet's really about, but Francis Bacon said, I write for adepts. I write for those who already know, or those smart enough to pierce the veil, direct quote. And I think I figured out how he did it is like he'll drop in bits of sun symbolism or eye symbolism. You know, what we all know now they do. They signal each other with code, but definitely the sun is one, which turns out is referenced over and over again in Romeo and Juliet as a god. Not just the sun, not just like, oh, what a nice sunny day, but the worshipped sun or the eye of the sun. Yeah, it's incredible.
Entity. Yeah.
So,
well, cool, man. We have covered so much here, and we might have to get you back on when you discover more stuff later on to fill in some more blanks and stuff. This is fascinating to me. I mean, that's why I connected with you, just to throw out what we're talking about, and I'll connect more with you to lay out more what we're talking about. I don't want to put it out there for.
Well, you told me, you sent me a text, and I like your guys' podcast. It's really great. I listen to it every chance I get.
Yeah, so we're super interested in the line of thinking you're investigating, and we're both kind of really into research too. So we would love to help if we could. But
excellent. Well, you know how to reach me. Let's stay in touch.
Yep, we still do. So thank you so much, Robert, for being on our show. We appreciate it, man.
Thanks. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening and supporting us. And remember, stay naturally supernatural.